drill. So I'm David Goldston. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an environmental group. But my involvement with this is more from my years on Capitol Hill, 20 years plus on Capitol Hill, including 6 as the Chief of Staff of the House Science Committee, and also teach and write on these subjects. Used to do a column for Nature on science policy. So what I've been asked to do is make some relatively quick comments. Rick or Sawyer or somebody, let me send a signal if I'm going long. And then we'll call up the panel, and we're going to try to do this as a real Q&A conversation, first between the panel and me and the panelists and each other, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. So we're switching now to directly deal with politics. I've heard it come up on and off all day while I've been here. So I wanted to make some general comments on politics and science that then both the panel can talk about, or we can have questions later. I feel like I should respond to the last question, though, which is I didn't actually hear anything that indicated scientists would be held to a higher standard than other groups. And in fact, that sense from scientists that other professions are not already held to these standards is actually a problem that scientists feel that way. And the sense that we're actually better, but we're treated worse is actually a big problem in the political sphere, and pretty much without basis from anything that I can know of. So I think it's actually a useful question, but maybe in the gossip sense of for what it communicates beneath the question. So let me talk about some of the issues in politics and science, as I said. So one of the things, there's been some, obviously this came up in some of the data on trust, but at least in the political sphere, the idea of science as a generic thing and scientists as a generic undifferentiated group, there's enormous trust to that, right? So everything in the political game these days actually is who can get to say the science is on my side. That's sort of getting the gold ring. You can see it in debate after debate after debate. That's how the debates are structured. And the more polarized and partisan, ideologically polarized, which is the bigger problem, but that tends to overlap the increasing partisan divide, the American political system becomes, the greater the value placed on science as the ultimate trump card. And so this is both an opportunity for scientists and a huge risk, because it means you're drawn into that. People both want to elevate you on a pedestal, and then the only way to win the issue is to knock off the pedestal the particular science or scientist that has been elevated. It also creates a phenomenon. People talk often about the politicization of science, which is certainly an issue, but I've been equally concerned about what I call the scientization of politics, which is basically taking fundamental issues on values, on politics, on economics. I'm talking about, when I talk about science here, I'm talking about natural and physical sciences. Economics, values, and basically trying to turn them into a science debate because that's the way you win. And partly because the public has this contemptuous view of politics, sort of odd in a democratic small d country, and lawyers and politicians. No one wants to have the debate on the basis of the values and the politics, which is really what the system is designed to do. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Two other sort of general thoughts relating to that. One is, in this question about trust of scientists in the political sphere, it's even more important maybe than in the way that, than in some of the general areas, to have this question about what do we mean by trust? Because often trust means, do they agree with me on the policy issue? Which actually is not exclusively a science question, right? And so I often say, the greatest fallacy that scientists sometimes have, and their allies sometimes have in the policy sphere, is if you knew what I knew, you'd think what I think. And so that's something to watch out for, what's actually being trusted and not. The other is, climate is in some ways an outlier issue in ways that I'll talk about in a minute. And yet, because of its prominence and indeed its importance, it tends to color the entire debate now or discussion about politics and science in ways that I think we have to watch out for, in the sense of not assuming everything follows the climate model, because I think it's unusual, but also watching how the debate over climate actually taints and affects everything else, even things that don't fit that model. Now, what I mean by that model. So I'll quickly, some people have heard this before, but quickly go through this sort of taxonomy I have on the way science and politics sometimes intersect. And there are basically 4 kinds of cases that I look at. One is what I call as a policy issue masquerading as a science issue. So these are issues where there's really no science to be debated at all. You could do science until kingdom come, and it wouldn't change the debate at all. Maybe every issue in some ways is like that, but it even shouldn't change the debate at all. And so examples are something like the 1997 debate about ozone regulations. This is different from the current debate, where at the time the science was that there are no deaths. There was a pretty standardized, pretty widely agreed on curve for X level of ozone. You got X number of additional hospital admissions. And really the only debate there for policy was, how many hospital admissions do you want? Guess how many people wanted to have that debate, right? 0. There is no premium in taking any side in that debate. So everybody involved started saying the science says it has to be this level. At the beginning, the science advisory group said, look, it's a policy call. We can't tell you the number. But the debate became so intense that tended to fray by the end, and all the science advisors were picking their particular level. It's rarely that clear, but I think we should always be asking, what actually is the role of science in the policy debate? Would more science actually have any impact on this? And again, part of this is recognizing that the values part of these debates is legitimate. It's not interfering with the science. It's the heart of the policy debate that the science is supposed to inform. The second case is there's a science and policy intersection, and there's pretty broad consensus on the science. This is actually fairly rare. Climate fits into this, at least if you're just talking about, is there anthropogenic climate change? We get a little bit beyond that. The consensus breaks down a little bit, but it's very unusual to have a situation where there's a clear consensus codified in the case of the climate situation, and the debate stays on the science. And there's all sorts of reasons that that's true in the climate arena. I'm happy to talk about that. I won't go on now, but the important thing is it's just one type of intersection and not the most common. The third is there's a scientific debate on a policy question, or policy has raised a question and asked for scientific information, and there's no agreement or no consensus. This is actually the case most of the time, right? What should be the blood level, the acceptable blood level of X? Part of the question, so there's a values question of that. What risks are you trying to guard against? But there's a science issue. What should be the level of arsenic in drinking water? What should you do to figure out a treatment for forests after a forest fire? You can easily find genuine scientific debate, and then you have to figure out the value judgments, the policy, what you want to do about uncertainty. What to do about uncertainty is not a science question. How much uncertainty there is a science question. And then the last case are issues where it's an entirely new field of science and everyone's saying, let's do the research. I sometimes say you can tell the debate isn't, that you can tell a mature debate because the language used is very immature, just finger pointing. These are issues where nobody knows what to do yet. So to pick one Dave's worked on over the years, nanotechnology or synthetic biology or something, where everyone just says, let's get some research. The trick or paradox with this is the same people calling for research for a regulatory purpose at the point when no one knows what to do will later say we shouldn't necessarily trust that research because it was done with regulation in mind. So there's sort of a catch 22 there that there's kind of no way around. It would be nice if anyone remembered it on the way in and not just on the way out, but that's the way it is. So I think, again, for all these questions, for all these types, what it underscores is more than science is at stake. Everyone tries to play on the trust on science, but that puts both policymakers and scientists in a little bit of a trap. How do you get the scientific information, convey it, rule out the policy options that science may say don't seem to work, without making the whole thing about science in a way that actually does injustice to both the science and the policy. I'll say two more things before bringing the panel up. So one is, we've heard, again, periodically today, and certainly at other meetings as well, this notion that if only people knew about the scientific method better, that would solve everything. Sometimes it reminds me of an old Doonesbury during the Watergate hearings, where one of the congressmen says to another, if only he'd have robbed a bank or something, then we'd have him. This desire for just something that will answer this. First of all, I think some of the science, two things. One is, scientists sometimes say when they're frustrated about the public just having this idea that science is facts, and they wonder, where do people get this? They usually get it from scientists, because when scientists aren't in their teaching mode, they say, you should listen to this because we have these facts. So, scientists have to pick their poison, to use an expression that was used earlier in a different context. The other is, I don't know that actually, if you actually got people to understand more details of the scientific method, people may get the idea, I think people get the idea that some studies are better than others. What that would actually do to the debate is not clear to me, because actually the power of science in the political sphere, the only reason anyone cares about it is because it appears to be a better way to get specific answers than other modes of human endeavor that can attack the same questions. I don't know of any politician or policymaker who is dying to find a different way to have an additional process conversation as part of policymaking. That's all we do. And so I think one really has to think through what that really means. And then the last point, another one about about a little learning being a dangerous thing, which maybe is the opposite of the point I just made. Scientists talk about peer review, about transparency, and so forth. People, including policymakers, take that to heart, and sometimes with perverse results, sometimes maybe deliberately perverse results. So one of the bills the House passed recently and the Senate just reported out of committee is a quote-unquote secret science bill that is designed to require, it gets to the question you asked, require every single bit of data to be put out immediately, or EPA can't look at a study, right? I mean, this is a great way to use the language of science to utterly shut down the regulatory system. And so I think, and where did they get that idea? Now, again, in that case, I think some of it may be deliberately perverse from my point of view, but some of it is taking to heart the language that they got from the scientific community, that everything should be transparent. So I always say one of the dangerous things in Washington is forgetting to think about what would happen if somebody believed you. Rhetoric, actually ends up mattering here because, again, it's sort of the coin of the realm. So with those maybe thoughts, cautions, complications, to use the word that I've been happy to hear the rest of the day, why don't we bring the panel up, and I'll start throwing some questions at them, and we'll go from there. Hi, Ann, how are you? Good to see you. Maybe I'll actually join the group for that. Is there enough? Are there enough? More than enough. Okay. Feel less like a game show host or something. So I'll let each of the panelists briefly introduce themselves as we go down the line. One of them you've obviously already heard from, but let me just say it's a distinguished panel of current and former policymakers, government officials, doing it this way, I was thinking that I didn't know whether to say that Congressman Holt had been elevated to his new position or declined to, so it depends on your view of Congress, I guess. But let me start with a broad question, and then people can also filter in some of their own comments that they're going to say in that. And I'll try to be a fairly harsh timekeeper and keep things going. But I was wondering if you could each talk maybe about a specific case you had to deal with where public trust or understanding of science was involved, and how you thought it through. What were the thorny things? What worked and what didn't? So we can start in any order. If you're ready, Anne, we can start with you. And again, say a little bit about your background.
Sure will. Top of the alphabet anyway. Well, good afternoon. I've been here all day, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. I'm Anne Bartuska. I'm currently the Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics at USDA. I've had a variety of positions in the federal government, including the head of research for the Forest Service, as well as a stint at the Nature Conservancy. And I think I've been dealing with science policy issues all the way back to the 80s, when I was one of the program managers for the infamous, or famous, as you look at it, NAPAP program, the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, arguably one of the best or worst examples of science and policy, science informing policy. So one of the things I wanted to bring to the table in an earlier conversation, which I'm going to use now to answer David's question, is an example that comes from the forestry world and a solution to how you build trust around a thorny scientific issue. And it has to do with the harvesting of trees for research purposes to get an understanding of forest dynamics when you have insects, diseases, and wildfires. And there has been in the milieu of cutting trees a whole lot of reaction that is not at no time acceptable, except maybe when you're going to clear an area around habitation and to prevent a wildfire. So we came up with this. It actually comes out of the European literature primarily, but an approach to developing these silvicultural treatments for research purposes in the spirit of participatory research. In this case, where we were working in Arkansas, we actually brought the community together, which included the environmental community, who had already threatened to sue us if we did anything in a research purpose. And this was not a management project, strictly a research project. But we brought the environmental community together. We brought members of the community together who were going to be beneficiaries from the timber side, but also those who were interested from the wildlife and fisheries side. We brought our own scientists, and then we brought the managers in who understood the treatments that we were trying to get at. And we actually walked through the scientific process. We asked, what is the most important question here to be addressed? Because we all agreed we wanted to improve the quality of the oak forest that was down there. But we laid out, we got a common understanding of what the scientific question was. We got an agreement on the treatments, and we actually went through 4 different treatments, including full clear cut, which in that community, think about this, if you follow the timber management wars, clear cutting is not something we want to do anymore, but they understood that that management technique would give us one of the points in a distribution of management. And then we also laid out the scientific method, although we didn't call it that, but this community was not only helped us do the analyses and the monitoring of the site, but then also helped inform the results and the conclusions part, and in some cases they were acknowledged in the publication. Now, that particular study is still in the works, but it was a really good example to me where you could take a very practical experiment, bring the community together to help resolve a thorny issue. And it has, I think, that approach has been very well used in the conservation world, where there are many of these controversial issues. And so I think that
Can I ask you one thing on that?
Sure.
So how public was the actual carrying out of the implementation of the process? Was it all private meetings?
No, very, very public. In fact, we opened it to the public. In fact, I believe it was published in the local newspaper. But there was something that was required. In order for us to do this, we actually had a piece of legislation that gave us what was called a silvicultural exemption that allowed us to use the NEPA process in a very creative way. But I thought it was a very good example of identifying the problem, coming up with a creative way of solving it, and then bringing the community together. And I really have seen more and more of this use of participatory research to really understand or to get the community to buy into a particular scientific endeavor. But one of the things it does, and the side benefit, is the scientific literacy. It's this being able to be a thoughtful thinker of why do we take this approach? How does that then translate to the outcome? It also develops a cadre of monitoring specialists, people who are out there wanting to be part of the solution. And I'd like to see that kind of approach used a lot more and built into our systems as well as our educational systems, because there are some skills that go along with it. So very long-winded answer.
No, that was great. I've got one more follow-up question, but I'm going to go to the rest of the panel first. Joe.
I'm Jo Handelsman. I'm the director of the Science Division in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. Previously, I was a professor at Yale University, and before that at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I'm a microbiologist by training. And I actually have three short examples, and some where we've been successful as a society and others not. So in 1985, I joined the faculty of the University of Wisconsin, and within the first year on the faculty, there was a company from Boston who decided they were going to introduce a genetically engineered bacterium called rhizobium into the soils of Wisconsin and do an experiment in northwest Wisconsin. And it sounded completely reasonable to me. It was a very simple genetic change they had made in the bacterium. But as you can imagine, there were a number of questions about it. So I don't think the university makes a habit of making their 3-month-old assistant professors the spokespeople for the university. But in that case, I happened to be the most relevant faculty member. And so I was called to Pepin County, Wisconsin, which is way up in rural Wisconsin, and I held town hall meetings, and we had all sorts of focus groups, many, many interventions. And that was, I would say, one of the most unsuccessful campaigns. That was the beginning of the GMO campaign. And 30 years later, people still think GMOs are dangerous. They think that they're going to change both the humans and the world around them, and fail to recognize that they're being introduced into a system of risk. And that was one of the things I found in the discussions with the people of Pepin County. One, they were all sure that they were going to get cancer from the rhizobium being in the soil. It just a completely disconnected idea. There are a lot of things you could actually paint as science fiction that would have at least some connection with the truth. There's absolutely no connection there. They just made that up, and for some reason, that was the concern. What they confused rhizobium with, I don't know, but they assumed that if it was an agricultural input, it had to be cancer-causing. The second thing they were worried about was having bacteria. Well, bacteria are bad, of course, and I remember the town commissioner, I think he was, saying something about how awful it was to have bacteria around. And when I informed him that there were typically 10 billion bacteria in a half a teaspoon of soil, he was just stupefied. He thought I was making it up. He said, no, that can't be true. And I said, yeah, that's really true. And haven't you seen kids eat soil? It's not bad for you. So he just went completely silent. And the rest of the room actually laughed. So that was an example of where these ideas were completely baseless, although that bacteria are bad at least has some connection to reality. The cancer part I never got. Of course, we moved very quickly because of one particular product of the bovine growth hormone to animal engineering. And that became the focus of the discussion, and then more recently, plant engineering has, I think, dominated the discussion. But the discussion hasn't changed. People talk about human health and environmental health with absolutely no data. And I think it's remarkable that 30 years later, I still have exactly the same conversations I did in 1985. So that's an example of where we weren't successful. We could talk about why we weren't successful in convincing people of the science, even though we used a very participatory process. But I'll leave it at that for now. The second one is in my current position, dealing with Ebola was one where there was sort of mass hysteria. And there was the challenge for the government of, do we make policy based on the facts that we know that this is not a very contagious virus, that the probability of most of the people coming into the country from Africa carrying it or infecting others was incredibly low, and that the dedication of enormous resources to screening and quarantine was not reasonable for every person in particular groups, which was what a lot of people were advocating, and some governors actually imposed in their states. And so we were trying to convince people that an infectious agent, which is a very horrible infectious agent, was actually not that infectious. And that was an apparent contradiction to people. I mean, if Ebola had the infectivity of flu, it would be disastrous. I mean, absolutely horrible. But it doesn't. In fact, it's reasonably hard to transmit. It doesn't travel through the air. Convincing people of that was really, I think, a no-win. We simply couldn't move people on that. So that was one where I think we also weren't successful, but there was a little bit more public debate about the facts. And that was where I felt we had made some progress in 30 years, that at least there were editorials and op-ed pieces in the papers that talked about why it was not reasonable to quarantine every person coming from West Africa into the US, and probabilities and the concept of infectivity.
Can we hold the third story for now?
Absolutely.
Those were both great. And I got follow-up questions on those, too.
I had a happy story.
Well, then let's definitely hold that. That can be the closing remark. So anyway, did you get, as the newly minted spokesman for the university, did you get any feedback on telling people they could eat dirt? Is one of my
It was a headline in one of the Wisconsin papers.
Rush,
Let them
please.
eat dirt. Right,
Yes.
that's right. Well, good stories. I'm Rush Holt. People like to call me a recovering public official. Actually, I kind of resist that characterization. I would argue that most of my colleagues in Congress are altruistic and, in their way, highly ethical. It is, at least they would say so. So as they see it, they are. Well, I guess I'd say, and who are you to say different? That's kind of the, but actually I'm here to raise my ethics. Is that the phrase that I think I heard from Dr. McDermott? So I find this really fascinating. And I would like to say a little bit, go a little more at an example of what I see at the root of the problem, rather than an actual case of distrust of science or scientists. A decade ago, in 2001, in fact, so more than that, when a terrorist sent anthrax through the mail, the Bacillus anthracis spores, and they found their way to Capitol Hill, some of my colleagues came to me and said, "You're a scientist, you must know about anthrax." Now, I scratched my head wondering where in the physics curriculum I missed. I'm a physicist by background.
Surely a fusion reaction would kill it, though.
Having taught at Swarthmore and NYU and worked at a DOE national lab for a number of years and so forth before going to Congress. And I thought that was really telling. It was telling in several senses. One was they were looking for someone to give them the facts. Should they take Cipro? Should they take amoxicillin? Who knew? And they wanted those facts cut and dried. And the other thing they knew was that scientists are the keepers of those facts. If only they would find the scientist, and I was the scientist in Congress. Actually, at the time, there was one other. Actually, depending on how you count and define scientists, there might have been 3 or 4 others. But certainly I was recognized as a scientist, and the way we have been teaching scientists for years in really all kids for years, there are really two cultures. You're going to be a scientist. You really should take chemistry and biology and physics in high school. You're not going to be a scientist. Well, you don't really need to take those things then, and certainly not in college. So I was designated as a scientist. I would know about anthrax. They couldn't know about anthrax. And I said, well, let's get some back issues of New England Journal of Medicine. We could read those. They said, oh, no, I couldn't read those. Well, I mean, I don't understand all of what I read in those articles, but I can learn a little bit about the susceptibility of Bacillus anthracis spores to ultraviolet light or to Clorox or, what. And I thought that was really very telling, that we have divided this country so much into two cultures that it's little surprise that people say, I can't understand what the scientists do, and if I can't understand it, how can I trust it? Scientists are partly to blame for that, maybe even largely to blame for that. I could say more. Yeah.
Thanks. Before I turn to Rose, two things I want to bring out on that. One is the focus on the science often obscures other things that would be easier. So in the anthrax incident, this isn't well known, but it was mostly in the Senate. That's where it was mailed. But it ended up in one House office building. Right, which turned out mostly via the feet of the Capitol Hill police, who had traveled from the Senate office buildings back over, which you didn't actually have to know a lot about anthrax, or really about the Capitol Hill police, frankly, to know that that would have been something to look at.
I actually have a better, I believe,
Sure.
more likely explanation.
Sure, okay.
One of the things we learned by reading the journal. One of the things I learned by reading the journal articles is spores of anthrax are tiny. An envelope, which looks like, a wall to us, between us and the letter, looks like a sieve to a Bacillus anthracis spore. And the letters were mailed from my district, at least some of them, probably all of them. The investigators botched it. The FBI, I could go on at length about how the FBI botched this whole investigation, right up to the point of declaring victory when the guy committed suicide. But what we didn't understand at first was that if you mail a letter and another letter is in the sorting box next to it, that letter will pick up anthrax spores. Letters coming from my district to Capitol Hill, some of them went to Senator Leahy, some of them came to my office probably just by touching. There were some spores found in my office. That's, I think, a likely way it came.
And then the other point
Little
is just
science lecture,
right.
sorry. That's, yeah.
Right. There's more on the sort of where the anthrax ended up, but on the more general point, this point about if you're a scientist, you're supposed to know everything. Really, one of the problems with a lot of debates is wars between, or inherent differences between different subfields of science, which become very important in most environmental issues. For example, the different approaches between epidemiologists and toxicologists, who would just as soon show the data would kill the whole other field. That's invisible to most policymakers. Not maybe so agency policymakers, but certainly when it's in the more political realm, because they want science to have an answer. And so the idea that you could have two embedded different approaches that could raise different questions and get you somewhat different answers, both of which have values attached. This notion of you're a scientist, just blinds everyone to all of that.
I wasn't here for the lectures this morning, for the presentation, but I would suspect the level of distrust, however you measure it, is not a whole lot different between chemists, physicists, environmental scientists.
Right. It's invisible. Even evolutionary biologists people will say they like them as scientists. Rose, other things that you've studied that may also fit with this example?
Well,
or other comments based on what you've heard?
I have a sort of bookend story to what Dr. Holt was just saying, which is one of these issues of science not trusting each other. So I'm a political scientist, but I do, as I mentioned, quite a lot of work on genetics. So we did a paper that was looking at the contribution of dispositional fear to attitudes toward immigration. And we sent it to a political science journal where the editor, who's a really big deal professor at a really big deal university, called us up and said, we'll accept this paper if you say you found the gene for fear. And I said, there is no gene for fear. And,
you clearly
once
lack
we
that
understand the gene for fear. And I said, so I sort of tried to give him a lecture about in any complex social process, it's inevitable that it's multifactorial, it's polygenetic, there's no way we could really talk about this outside of a developmental context. He said, no, you don't understand. If you say you found the gene for fear, I'll get you on the front page of the New York Times. And I said, you don't understand. I don't give a shit about being on the front page of the New York Times if it's going to compromise my academic credibility. I'm not going to say something I know is a lie. And he said, well, then we're not going to publish the paper. And I said, fine. So we sent it to another paper that actually cared about the science. But he didn't understand, but more importantly, he kind of didn't care. Yeah. Like, once I told him that this isn't what's true, he didn't care. He just wanted the publicity. And so that's the flip side of the, wanting the sort of attention and acclaim that, public, exposure can lead to.
Great, thanks. Let me ask one question each to our first two speakers, and then we'll open it up. So, Anne, you had made a point that when you're talking about everyone had the same goal in terms of the oak forest in your example. How did you establish that? And because often in this sort of looks like a science debate actually is a values debate over whether everyone does have the same goal, or at least the same notion about the tools for the same goal. So did you do something to establish that, or there was a sense that everyone knew that? Did it become explicit in some way? How important was that in making progress?
This is where going slow to go fast is sort of the maxim. And no, I think what you have to start with is trying to reach that common goal, no matter how simplistic it is. And you can't definitely jump to, well, we want to have some kind of complex ecosystem. Right. It's really, what is it that benefits everyone? And having living oak trees benefits the wildlife, it benefits the fish, it benefits the conservation community, it benefits the local community. So getting to that common statement takes time. Right. This is where you have trained facilitators, community leaders, you're getting everybody there to really think through it, and I think that is an essential first step. And frankly, for those of us who dealt with NEPA over the years, it's clearly laid out in the bill that initial step is part of the process, but we get through it so fast that, in fact, I think we sort of forget that process is actually a very good process.
And for anybody who's lucky enough not to know, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, the sort of foundational law that was passed in 1969, took effect in 1970, that established the Council on Environmental Quality, and is basically what lays out the process for environmental impact statements, is what it's most known for. No problem. Joe, so in both your examples, you were, and you mentioned this, you were talking about risk, which obviously has both a complex scientific element about calculating it and this values element, right? So on the Ebola case, I mean, the fears may have been, clearly were exaggerated. On the other hand, if Governor Christie had said, I just want a higher level of safety than those guys do, that would have been a different kind of debate. And you have a case like AIDS, where things did move from a sense of extreme, what now we see as extreme measures, to something more open. And similar on the with the GMO case, at least now maybe in some ways, there's this question of sort of how much risk, which risks. How do you sort of, first of all, when you're having the discussion in the White House, how do you sort of separate that out from the science? And when you're communicating it, how do you deal with the fact that there's both this element of a value of how much risk is acceptable, and then the scientific question, which may also be cloudy, about what the level of risk is?
So I think one of the advantages in this administration is that the president consistently speaks about evidence and in an evidence-based way. And I think he very subtly sometimes and very directly other times talks about science and scientific data. And I think that has entered the American consciousness. And that's where I think my good story comes from in terms. Okay, my good story is just antibiotic resistance, which is something the administration has worked very hard on. And I believe that I did actually a small, not scientific survey in the mid-2000s as part of making a video about people's attitudes about microbiology and their knowledge of it. And to a person, every single person we interviewed in the lay public in a very educated environment said that your body becomes resistant to antibiotics. And that may be better than not knowing anything, but it's not correct. Now, I think most people, and from what I've seen and heard in similar informal surveys, I think most people would know that it's the bacteria that are becoming resistant and would understand the connection between antibiotic use and resistance. And maybe they couldn't tell you in eloquent evolutionary terms, but they'd get the general idea. And so that's a good example, and I think part of that is the visibility that the president has given to that particular topic and given in a very, in my opinion, very clear and logical way, explained the connection between antibiotic use and the harm to humans. So I think that's one example of where leadership can make a difference. I don't think it's the only place. I think we also need not just political leadership, but leadership in the media to change the way we present science. We can talk more about that. And also, we need to change the way we introduce people to science in school, and I think there's a lot to say on that.
So can I just push back on that?
Sure.
Just open it up. Oh, sorry. So on the antibiotics thing, I mean, it's great the way the administration is, and including the president taking the bull by the horns on this issue. But two questions. One, so on the agriculture aspect of it, right, there's still debate. Certainly the ag community still keeps raising debate about the link between animal agriculture and antibiotic resistance. And my sense, with an extremely unscientific survey of talking to educated friends, think, yeah, I don't want antibiotics used in these food because they think the issue is antibiotic residues in the food, not the evolutionary impact on the bacteria. So can you talk a little bit, I mean, in that case, how the debate works, where there is, I mean, how do you decide how much real scientific debate there is on that? And is it a problem that the public, thinks the wrong thing if they come to the right conclusion?
Well, I think in cases where safety is at stake, no matter how they get to the right conclusion, it's better. But it certainly is preferable for them to make their way there through a scientific and legitimate process. And I think that's a tough one. The agriculture issue is one that we've debated extensively. And the President's Council of Advisors issued a report on the antibiotic issue. And it was interesting to watch the evolution of the report because they weren't at first reading all of the original literature, and we started arguing with them, and there was a real change in attitude when they got down to actually reading the papers. And in fact, it was a physicist who sat down and just read all the papers that I gave him, and he came to the same conclusion that I did, even though he didn't understand the microbiology in it. He certainly understood the principles of what was being done. And so I think we have the same debates that any group of scientists would have. We don't debate climate change, I would say, but we do talk about when there's evidence that's inconsistent with climate change or when someone brings up a new argument, we certainly ask the climate change experts among us or outside what the explanation is, and so that we all have an understanding of how it fits together. So I think there are generally accepted beliefs about science. I hate the word belief because we don't really believe things, but accepting the science of something like climate change where the debate is over. There are other things like antibiotic use where the debate goes on. And I think we do need to clarify for the public where those risks are. And in fact, one thing I've noticed over the years is very often the public is worried about something that turns out to be important in the end. And there is some recent evidence of antibiotics actually in the food, which is not a great thing either. It's not our prime concern, but it actually is something people have talked about a lot in that regulation.
I'm going to hold anything else I have to say so that we can open it up to questions from the audience. If there aren't any, I'll keep going, but yes, go ahead.
Jessica Brooks, Science Technology Policy Institute. I'm curious, can you think of a way that science could come out in front of the political or cultural narratives that sometimes, arise around issues like Ebola or climate change? Besides the president literally coming up and giving a speech, is there sort of an individual or a group? Is there a way to identify the person who should speak to it and identify the platform proactively so that these sort of issues can be resolved sort of in that way?
And when you start.
Actually, great opening for one of the things I did want to talk about. And my professional society is the Ecological Site of America, and they've actually established a process to, I think, do what you just said. It was quite a few years ago they realized, actually, when they first came to Washington to try to be relevant and move the head of our society here, it was to be policy relevant. And we, especially in the environmental community, the ecologists, the vast array of that kind of science, we were in the middle of a lot of policy issues, at least our science was. And one of the tools that they've now developed is they actually have established a rapid response team within the scientific community of the professional society. And because they have people here in Washington who are paying attention to what's happening at Congress, at the agencies, if they see or hear a particular issue starting to rise up that deals with ecological and environmental issues, they will pull these members of the academic and federal science community together to develop a white paper, with one of the hallmarks being that it is very easily understood. It's got a couple bottom line nuggets so that anybody can take away what the point is without being a scientist, but it has the basis of a good solid peer review behind it. And what we've found now that we've been established for a few years is I think we've achieved what we wanted to, which we are a neutral, unbiased purveyor of scientific information and ecological and environmental issues, and that it has proven to be very effective. So that's one mechanism that I think has shown practical value.
Well, just as someone who used to be on the ESA Public Affairs Committee, two things. One is that it's a great program, and there are a couple of other ones that have grown out of the Ecological Site, including the Leopold Fellowships. But I'd say two things. One is, I'm not sure exactly what you meant by your question, but if the implication is that somehow the cultural narrative is illegitimate, that's a problem, right? These are all within again, of values. I mean, it's one reason why I'd asked Dan that question about establishing what do people agree on the goal before you get into where the science ends up. And so it's important, and the success of the Ecological Site is especially noteworthy because one of the ways that science gets its legitimacy in American society is the further it appears from politics, the more, and politicians rely on that too. And part of the problem with climate change and with most ecological issues is that the science and the policy questions are so inherently close and sometimes even fused and confused that it makes it that much harder for the scientists to sort of establish their bona fides. So it's an interesting example. Dave.
Actually, may I
Rush,
address
please,
that?
yes.
Because I think you began to say, how could we get out in front of the emerging issues? I think the only effective way is to work really hard at educating the public. We cannot guess. There's nobody in this room or no collection of people in this room smart enough to guess what the next emerging public misunderstanding is going to be, whether it's Ebola or microbes in the soil. And so we really have to work at helping people understand it and not saying to them, you can't. There's a journalist who 60, 70 years ago said something that I've kind of used as a dictum in my public service, which is never never overestimate the knowledge of the people and never underestimate their wisdom. And we've got to help them deal with these things. And I would be very uncomfortable if they luck into doing the right thing for the wrong reason, if we have missed the opportunity to teach them. So talking about risk, you know, back in 1958, Congress passed something called the Delaney Clause that said cancer, carcinogens, 0. You cannot allow any carcinogen into the system. Well, any scientist would say, well, come on, you can't do that. And, you know, it's unreasonable to try to get things down to 0 risk, creating other risks in the process. Why not help the public understand the concept of risk? Why not help the public understand statistical reasoning? That's the prescription for dealing with the next risky misunderstanding. And so, you know, it's a tall order. It's kind of what this, you know, public interfaces is about, I think. It's a very, very tall order, but I think it's essential.
And in 1996, Congress did repeal the Delaney Clause, right? It's part of the
Yes,
Food Quality and Protection Act.
But failed to take the opportunity to teach the public about statistical thinking and risks.
Right. Dave.
Yeah, Dave Verjeski from the Wilson Center. Here's an issue that's here right now. I will predict it will be a trust train wreck, and we could think about, I'd like to actually get the opinion of the panel on how to deal with this, and that's germline modification. Okay? Germline modification, right? So a month ago, some of you might have seen a piece in the front page of the Washington Times, the people that have developed a technology called CRISPR-Cas basically come out and say, this allows us to very easily modify and edit the genome. And those modifications could be transmitted through sexual reproduction to other generations, okay? They asked for a moratorium and another asilomar, right? Nothing happens, essentially. There's arguments between David Baltimore and a bunch of microbiologists. 3 weeks later, the Chinese used this technology to try to modify the human genome across a generation, and it fails pretty miserably. We know the technology has already been used on insects. One of the things that I thought was kind of a moral red light was we don't mess around with germline modification, and nothing has happened. I've seen no response from the White House, the Congress, anyone. Finally, Francis Collins put up a letter on the NIH webpage that said, we won't fund this kind of technology with NIH funds. But if you want to see a train wreck and trust, what happens when this story actually gets out? I mean, I thought this was a place that morally we decided religiously and scientifically we wouldn't go there. And it's out. So I guess the question is, it's not something that's 10 years from now, it's right now. And what would you do about this? What should the Congress do about this? Should we have hearings? What should the White House do? What should the agencies do? What should AAAS do, or the academies, or what should I do in the Wilson Center? I mean, to me, it's right here, and I'd love to sort of see, just as a test case, whether everybody has any ideas on that.
So why don't we go down the line, starting with Rose if you want, or you can pass.
I actually don't feel like I know enough to make a reasonable comment.
Well, you're right. There has been a lot of discussion, and so far, no action. It's not clear to any of us who have been talking about it that we see a path to the action. I mean, this CRISPR technology is even easier to use than the early recombinant DNA techniques that the asilomar folks were trying to rein in, or at least box in, whatever. It's not clear to anybody I've talked to what good an asilomar conference would do now. I mean, at AAAS, we've talked about hosting one, and maybe something will happen, but I have yet to be told, you know, where it might lead, you know, what positive outcome we might get.
Well, unfortunately,
Someone in office.
I can't comment entirely, but I wouldn't assume that everything that you see is what's going on and what you will see in the coming months. So non-governmental groups have gotten together and are planning a meeting, hopefully an international meeting that will be co-hosted with other countries that have an interest in this technology. We're working on policy in the White House and discussing all of the obvious issues, and I think I can talk about the issues that come up. One is it reasonable to stick with the position that this is a line we don't cross, to use Francis Collins's language? Well, there's an act in Congress that says we will not manipulate embryos. We won't create them or hurt them or destroy them for research purposes. So that covers pretty well all of research that's funded by HHS, for example. So we have very clear policy there. But outside of that, we don't. It turns out we don't have language in the law if it was funded by another department, another agency. We also have FDA control, and FDA has also said that they would have a fairly blanket position on it, and they have in the past. That's consistent with what they've done in the past. But interestingly, there's been a lot of push for FDA to make a moral statement and make arguments about why this isn't a good thing. And FDA's mandate by law is to regulate based on safety only. And so there's a call for parts of government to do things that they can't do by law. And then the issue is, even if we all agree here that germline editing, here meaning America, that germline editing is not acceptable and it's not something we want to do for any purpose, and some people argue we should for disease purposes but not for enhancing humans, there are other countries that have made it quite clear that they're doing it, and that this Chinese paper is probably the first of many and the first of papers that will certainly manifest in real embryos. The paper that was published had embryos that couldn't develop, so there was no question that it was only a research point. But I think that there was pretty good evidence there, and there have been comments publicly from the head of the Beijing Genome Institute that they don't plan to, at least some of the Chinese scientists don't plan to adhere necessarily to US standards on this. So this definitely warrants an international debate, because there isn't clearly a right answer. It's an ethical decision. We don't even know fully about the safety aspects of it. And we may agree in this country, but we can't impose those values necessarily unless we can persuade all other countries to agree with us.
I can't trump that, but I will say that part of the reason why USDA is going to join this roundtable is because we need to have this kind of a dialogue that directly connects to the public. And just having it in the policy world and the science world is just going to be one other scenario that we've had in the past. But how do we already, as these things are emerging, have this, it's not a public dialogue. There's some new tool here. There's some different combination. And I guess I'm hoping that this is the community that will help us think through how do you actually take on these really thorny issues that have the potential to be a trust train wreck, and not let them happen because we have had some other step in the process. So it's something for this group to actually think about.
Great. So our afternoon moderator says we should cut off questions. We're about to go into the break, so hopefully people will be able to ask them. Just a couple of quick last thoughts. One is the kind of question that Dave asked, and neuroscience raises these questions all over the place. And I often say, it's going to make most of the other debates we've had look like a picnic. And so it's another area to think about. And obviously the neuroscience community actually has been thinking about them, but I'm not sure has gotten them under control. A couple of times now, understandably and most clearly with Congressman Holt's comments, law comes up, and sort of how to get, the blunt instrument of law to include science and what actually works in the context of law, which is different from what you might do in a lab context, is another complication that we sort of lightly tripped over, but is worth more thinking. The last thing I'd say, that the journalistic quote sounded like a very sanitized version of H.L. Mencken's supposed comment that no one ever lost money overestimating the intelligence of the American people, which is hopefully not the way people are thinking here. And so I thought I'd leave with a kinder but more complicated one, which is E.B. White once said, democracy is nothing more than the recurring suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. And so that sort of gives a sense of how complicated and fragile all of these issues are and why it's important to have sessions like the one today. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and we'll continue after break.